Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first session of day 2 of Netroots Nation. And I really appreciate your time and joining us. I know you had at least 15 other choices, so thank you for joining us. My name is Quinn Tu. I am counsel at Boulder Advocacy, which is a program of Alliance for Justice. I'll explain what that is in a minute. I'd like to invite my colleague Sham to introduce himself briefly.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining. My name is Sham Subramanian and I'm counsel also with the Boulder Advocacy Program of Alliance for Justice, and I'm based in our Northern California office. So today I'll be monitoring questions and supporting Quinn.
Thank you. And he will be adding his wisdom as appropriate. So feel free to drop in your questions in the chat. We will stop at some points along the way to answer those questions, and Sean may even take some of them just in the chat if it's not germane to today's presentation, but it's something that we can help with as well. So you have my contact information there on your slide, and also on the Google Docs. I shared that with you as well. Okay, so here is some information about Boulder Advocacy, and I'll take a step back and explain to you. Alliance for Justice is a C3 as well. We are based in Washington, D.C. As Sean mentioned, he is in the Northern California office. I am in the Southern California office, and we also have offices in Dallas and Houston. We are a program of Alliance for Justice. Alliance for Justice has two parts. One is focused on judicial diversity and researching the federal judges who get appointed to the bench. Because of that work, we also have an affiliated C4 called Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. But for the most part, Sham and I do the majority of our work through our C3. So the second part of AFJ is Boulder Advocacy. We, to confuse matter, have a separate website called boulderadvocacy.org, where there are free tools, fact sheets, and publications that can help you as you navigate the complex rules of nonprofit advocacy. We also offer a technical assistance hotline that is free to everybody, and you can access it either through emailing us at advocacy@afj.org or calling us on the phone. I've given you that information there, and I see that Sham's also dropped it in the chat as well. Feel free to follow us on social. The one disclaimer that I will make in this training is that even though we provide many legal resources and free technical assistance, we are not your lawyer and can't offer legal advice. We don't represent anybody. But we can help you navigate the complex web of nonprofit advocacy rules, as I was saying earlier. Okay, so today's agenda is going to be 4 things. We're going to cover and have a broad overview of the types of nonprofit organizations, understand the ways nonprofits can advocate, and we're going to spend some time talking about how C3s must remain nonpartisan during transition advocacy. And then we're going to end and wrap up with how to know when your transition advocacy counts as lobbying. And this is all in prepping ourselves for what kind of a world we're going to have after the November general election. All right, so first topic is going to be types of nonprofit organization. And here is my first and only poll of the day. I'd like to know, and you can put it in the chat, if you work for a 501c3 public charity or private foundation, a C4, both a C3 and a C4 like Sham and I, a C5 labor organization, a 527 political organization, other, and if you choose other, please share if that's like a private for-profit business or the government or any other form of organization. Or your last option is, I'm not sure, or I don't know. If you fall into that category, this is a perfect example of how we can help you in the technical assistance arena as well. We can help you figure out if you are working for a nonprofit organization or if you're not. But generally people know that, they just don't know if they're a C3, C4. So.
And I should
Okay.
mention, we have a lot of resources on our website for C4s as well.
Yes. So I see a whole bunch of C3s and some with C3s and C4s in the chat. Okay. So we're going to try to cover and include everybody in the conversations today, but hopefully as we go through, you'll understand why sometimes we specifically focus on C3s because they have some limitations. All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing with me what organizations you work with. Okay, we're going to talk about the types of nonprofits now, and this is a very, very broad overview. We can certainly have more in-depth conversation with you on any of these subjects. Feel free to reach out to us for that. So C3s, commonly they're referred to as they are referred to as 501c3. Commonly, we're talking about public charities. This category also includes private foundations. And if you're a private foundation, you'll know it. But most of the time, we're talking about public charities. And as I said, Alliance for Justice is an example. What makes something an organization a C3 is that they have applied for and gotten tax exempt status from the IRS, so they don't pay income taxes generally, and they have this really sweet favorable tax deduction that they can offer to donors, right? If you go to an organization's webpage and you click on the donate button and it says your contributions may be tax deductible, you're likely looking at a C3 organization. So that is a tax treatment that allows a C3 to raise money pretty easily because people can write it off as a tax donation, but people also want to support public charities. So in exchange for that, the IRS has limited the amount of lobbying that a 501c3 can do. And it has also said in a very bright line rule kind of way that is rare in this sphere, is that a 501c3 cannot support or oppose candidates for public office. So we will spend some time today talking about those two, the limitations on lobbying and the outright prohibition of not being able to support or oppose candidates for public office. As a contrast to the 501c3s, I've grouped together the C4s, 5s, and 6s into this category because they have very similar tax treatments. They're also tax-exempt organization, but because they don't have the ability to tell donors, hey, you can have a tax write-off if you donate to us, they, in turn, are not limited by their lobbying activities. They still have to track and report them to the IRS, but they're not limited in how much lobbying they can do. Groups in this category, the C4s, 5s, and 6s, can do a certain amount of electoral activities. In other words, support candidates or support political parties as long as it's their secondary activity and they are following federal and state election laws. So we'll get into some of that as well today. And then for comparison, there's the 527s, or political organizations. So Emily's List is probably very familiar to this group of people. They are also a tax-exempt organization, and they rarely get involved in lobbying. And if they do, they're usually taxed on it. But 527s are solely in the political arena. Usually they're created to help a group of candidates get elected, or one candidate or political party. So that's the realm that they play in. Okay. So that was the brief overview of types of nonprofit organizations. I'm going to stop very briefly to see if we have any questions.
Not seeing any in the chat box right now.
Okay, so as a reminder, keep them coming if you have them in the chat box, and we'll move on. We're going to talk briefly about how you, as nonprofit organization employees, staff, volunteers, can continue to advocate in this time of pre-election and post-election. So we generally call it the transition part of an administration. Okay, so what is advocacy and why is it important? Well, I would propose to you that advocacy is a tool for achieving policy and community change. So this was a tweet yesterday from Miss Foundation for Women, and it just talks about how Black women do not have pay equality, and this is a policy change that a C3 can certainly push for. It's a policy change that a C4 can certainly work on and push for as well. It's an advocacy thing that allows groups to get policy and community change because none of us can do this alone. So we need all of your voices in this matter. And as nonprofits, you have expertise in whatever mission or core issues that you work on a day-to-day basis. So we also just want to remind people, because there is a misconception out there, nonprofits can advocate and lobby for policy change. Nonprofits do it all the time, but there are some people who are confused and will tell you that's not true. So here are the types of nonprofit advocacy, or some of them. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, right? These are all things that any nonprofit can get involved in. Lobbying is a piece that we'll come back to. It's in yellow because there are some rules and limitations if you're a C3 that you have to be aware of. There's as well. And then supporting or opposing candidates, which are also called partisan activity, is something that I shared with you earlier, is an absolute prohibition for C3s. So that's why it's in red. Given the state of the news, I'd like to focus on two types of advocacy this morning. One is election protection. This is something that C3s, 4s, 5s, 6s can get involved in. And so this tweet from the Massachusetts Attorney General talking about the integrity of our elections and how everyone, regardless of party, should be fighting for a fair, safe election by ensuring that the Postal Service can manage the increased mail-in ballots, right? This message you could put out as a C3 or C4 because it's not political in the sense that it's supporting or opposing a candidate, and we'll get into that further on in this training, but this is a message that nonprofits can do. Also, oops, because I moved something, my movement is now Okay, advanced slide. Oh, here we go. Okay, here's another one, encouraging voting. This is also another type of advocacy that your nonprofit can certainly do at this point in time. Even though this tweet from Hillary Clinton does say lean on your Republican legislators to join the fight to save the USPS, you'll learn a little bit later in this presentation that that may count as lobbying, but it's not something that is prohibited for nonprofit organizations. The part that I really want to draw your attention to is the second part where she says, then make a plan for how you'll cast your vote. And there's a link that gives you 4 ways to safely cast your vote without the post office, right? That second part of the message is something that you could be saying from now up until election day as a nonprofit, and it is perfectly acceptable advocacy to engage in, whether you're a C3 or C4. Okay. And just another resource you could post or share with your constituents is if people are confused about whether or not they can vote or how they can vote, the National Association of Secretaries of State has a website, as do a few other national nonprofits that focus on voting rights that you can encourage people to go to as well. So these are all things that you could post on your social media, on your webpage in this period to be progressive advocates and help people counter the mixed messages that they're getting from the Trump administration. Okay. Any questions on that section of nonprofit advocacy? I know we've gone through these in fairly quick succession, but I do want to make sure that we have time to cover everything we need to cover. And as Sham has mentioned in the beginning, and posted in the chat a few times, and he'll continue to do so, you can always reach out to us later for more specific one-on-one conversations or questions about your particular situation on our technical assistance hotline.
Not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay, perfect. Then let's talk about this next part in the agenda. 501c3s must remain nonpartisan during transition advocacy. And nonpartisan is not what you think it means. Nonpartisan, in normal people term, we would think about a political party, right? Nonpartisan to the IRS means whether or not a 501c3 is supporting or opposing a candidate for public office. So this sample ballot where we're electing the mayor for the city of Edina, you'll see that there's just a list of names on here. If you work for a 501c3, you're still not able to support or oppose any one of these candidates, because if you do so, it would be considered partisan. If you are working for representing a C4, this is something that you could get involved in. You could get in the endorsement process if it was your secondary activity. So there's some analysis that goes into that, and we'd be happy to talk about that offline, since there were only a few people today who mentioned that they were with the C3 and C4. Okay, so 501c3s can talk about what happened in the election and what may happen. So talking about prospective elections or things that are going to come down the pipe. But it's really risky to take credit for an election outcome or to look forward to the next election. And we're going to see some examples of this. So I see a question that popped up. That's a very good question about if you're allowed to support a candidate as a private citizen outside of your work, with a C3? The answer to that is yes, absolutely. The rules that we're talking about today only apply to you and affect you if you are representing a C3 or C4. But if you're acting in your own individual capacity, then you still have your First Amendment rights. They are not abridged in any way just because you happen to work for a C3 or a C4, etc. You just have to be clear that you're acting in your own capacity. And we do have some fact sheets on how you can do that, and some ways that you could do that on social media to make it clear to people that this is your personal opinion versus this is your organization's position on something. Thank you for that question. That was something that we usually include in our training, but for timing's sake, I did not put any kind of slides in this, and it's a really important question to know.
One
Okay.
exception is with certain types of federal funding, it may restrict what you can do even in your individual capacity. So if you do receive federal funding, that's worth looking into, but otherwise you're not restricted.
Darn federal government, making our lives so complicated. All right, so let's talk about how a nonprofit can take positions post-election. This example came from the last major general election we had in 2016. So shortly after that, Ms. Foundation Women posted that this Alabama county just selected 9 Black women to become judges, right? So this is something that doesn't focus on supporting or opposing anybody for public office, right? Ms. Foundation for Women is a C3, and they, in their short message, has not implied that they had any kind of role in the outcome of this election. And remember how I said, you know, C3s cannot support or oppose anybody for public office? People often forget about judges who are elected in some parts of the country, right? If they're on the ballot, your C3 cannot support or oppose them. So this was a message that is very C3 safe. That also means that it's C4 safe as well, as long as the C4 is not just working on electing these or any other judges or people to public office, and it's their secondary activity. Okay, this is looking forward to the November election, right? So Emily's List, which is a 527 or political organization, posted that Kamala Harris will be one of the most qualified and experienced vice presidents in American history. Full stop. So Emily's List as a 527 can do this because that's all they focus on is getting people and parties elected. If you looked at this from a C3 perspective, it is very problematic. C3s, because they cannot support or oppose candidates for public office, cannot comment on the qualifications for somebody's fitness to hold office, right? C4, you can if this was not your primary activity, but a secondary activity. And if you shared with us your email, we'll also in the follow-up email that we're going to send to you, include a blog post that our colleague just published yesterday on how C3s can talk about this historic selection of Kamala Harris to the VP. So there are ways that C3s can talk about this in a safe manner. And we I have personally gotten a few inquiries as soon as news broke about how somebody at a C3 can talk about this. So I'm sure that my other colleagues have gotten questions as well. Okay, here's another one that is talking about the November election. And I've blanked out the author of this tweet because I want you to put your organization on there, whether it's a C3, a C4, a 527. Okay, it says, surprised anybody? Hashtag remember in November, vote blue to save America. So very, very problematic for a C3 to do, right? You can't support or oppose anybody for public office. Vote blue to save America implies that you're supporting the Democratic Party. Remember in November also implies that you're opposing the current administration. So just as you can't support somebody, you can't oppose somebody. And this also looks to be a retweet or a screen capture of a private individual's comment as well, right? Presumably posted on Twitter. If your organization is reposting or retweeting, the IRS considers that you've adopted whatever message that is. It's as good as if you've typed that very same message in there. So be careful about what the content is if you're retweeting. It might be attributed to your organization as well. Okay, here's really looking forward to the next election in 2024, right? If your organization said, I can't wait for the day when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez becomes the first woman/Hispanic to become president of the United States, hashtag AOC 2024. Well, even though she hasn't declared that she's running for candidate for president of the United States in 2024, as a nonprofit organization, if you are putting her out there or you're retweeting somebody's message that supports AOC for presidency, you may be getting involved in electioneering work. And depending on whether you're a C3, that's not allowed. For a C4, as long as it's your secondary activity, then you could engage in some of this work. So we can't look forward to November or to 4 years from now and all of a sudden not have the restrictions that we normally would have anyways. So this is important that you know if you're acting on behalf of a C3, a C4, or any other organizations that are there. Okay, so C3s, even though you cannot support or oppose anybody who's running for public office, you can tell the winning candidate, so the person who is going to assume elected office, what you'd like them to do in their official capacity. And you can respond to comments and decisions that they've made. So this becomes more important once we have our November election and know what the results are. But you should remember that it is considered lobbying, or it can be lobbying depending on what you're telling them. Okay, any questions about that part of nonpartisan
Yes.
requirement? I'm sorry.
So there's one question, Quinn, I think would be good to address with the group. So Jeff asks, is this kosher? Climate change is bad. We're not telling you whom to vote for, but Joe Smith has better policies than Jane Jones.
You want to take that one? And
Sure. Yeah.
start.
And I also put this in the chat, but one thing is that the IRS looks at all the facts and circumstances when determining if a message is partisan. So it's not just about an explicit endorsement, but also an implicit endorsement. So I think it is risky to say, you know, we're not telling you to vote, but this person has much better policies than so-and-so. Some other factors they would look at whether it's a wedge issue in the campaign. So in 2016, you know, if you were to say something like, build bridges, not walls, vote in November, that would be high risk for a C3. So those are a couple of the factors that the IRS would look at.
Yeah, and Sham put in another factor in responding to is if it's core to your organization's mission. If you're an environmental protection group, it's less risky to talk about it. It is an assessment of risk, and this is where, because of time, I didn't get into all of those details, but we get these questions all the time, especially during the Democratic primaries when we had a very full field of people and groups wanted to talk about, well, can we compare the different contenders' positions and policy stance on immigration or, decarceration or any number of other issues. So it is an analysis that we're happy to walk through with you, and then you can make a decision on how comfortable your organization is with the risk and proceed accordingly.
And briefly, I'll just mention the IRS does allow C3s to put out nonpartisan voter guides where you're outlining candidate positions, but there are specific guidelines around that, but we're happy to talk with you afterwards.
Yeah. All right, let's cover transition advocacy and when that counts as lobbying, because that's also important to keep in mind. This is a very distinct concept from being nonpartisan, right? Nonpartisan is all about what or who you're supporting or opposing in an election. Lobbying, as you will learn, is all about talking to a legislator or their staff or somebody who has the power to vote on a piece of legislation or vote on something. So first, there are two ways to measure lobbying. One is called the insubstantial part test. And if you are a 501c3 that just formed and did nothing else, this is the default test that the IRS will measure your lobbying activities by. This test is problematic because there are no clear definition of what insubstantial is. There's no way to measure a unit of effort to even try to begin to quantify what insubstantial is. We know from IRS rulings and guidance that it's about 3 to 5% of your organization's activities. But because there's no clear definition, there's no way that we can really be certain if we're hitting the 3 to 5% mark at all. The second way to measure lobbying is what's called the 501H expenditure tests. And this is a one-time election that your C3 would have to make, and you do that by submitting a form to the IRS. It's very, very simple and straightforward form. And once you make that election, you're telling the IRS that you want them to measure your lobbying activities based on expenditures only, based on your organization's exempt expenditure. So because of that, there is a formula that you can know what your lobbying limit is by calculating what your expenditure is. And we do have a lobbying limit calculator on our website, and we're happy to share that with you as well. But the great thing about the expenditure tests is that there are clear definitions of lobbying. So unless you're a house of worship or you're an organization that spends significant, and by significant, we're talking 17 million plus, right? The 501H election makes a lot more sense than the insubstantial part tests. But again, this could also have a couple other factors involved in this decision, and we have fact sheets on this. We're happy to follow up with you on this issue if you're not clear if your organization's made this expenditure test election. We can help you clarify that as well. But it's important to know how lobbying is measured because you want to keep track of your lobbying activities because the IRS requires reporting on Form 990, okay? So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the lobbying definitions under the 501H tests. So here is direct lobbying. If you're going to do direct lobbying under 501H, you have to have a communication. So that can be a tweet, that can be a phone call, that can be talking to somebody in person, sending an email. You know, if they are hearing your message, you're communicating to them. The next part that's required is that you're talking to a legislator or their staff, right? So, and that's legislator on all levels. That's the federal level, the state level, but also the local level. So your city councils, your board of supervisors, tribal councils, those all are considered to be legislators. And if we are talking about a ballot measure, in the context of a ballot measure only, where it is submitted to the public for a vote, the public becomes a legislator in that context. So you have to have that. And then you also have to express a view about a specific piece of legislation, right? So this tweet by Unemployed Action is talking about how the executive order created by Trump doesn't do anything to help American workers and families. And they're demanding that Republicans get back to the negotiation tables, right? It's calling out specifically Senators Collin, McConnell, Representative Meadows, and Steve Mnuchin. So at least the first three are legislators. And even though it doesn't mention a specific bill, they have been talking about the HEROES Act and the HEALS Act and a bunch of other bills that are pending at this point to help people deal with the economic strains from COVID-19, right? So this could be a piece of lobbying under 501H. But here, I want to get a little bit more into what counts as specific legislation. So obviously, if you have the name, like the HEROES Act or a bill number, you're talking about a specific piece of legislation. If you're talking about a budget, so here we're dealing with the California state budget for 2020 and 2021. So if you're talking to your governor or your mayor about a budget line item, it counts as specific legislation. For the purposes of positions that require a nomination and a confirmation vote, so in this case, you know, the Supreme Court justice has to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So during the process when Justice Sotomayor was going through the nomination process, if you wanted to talk to your senator about whether or not to support her nomination, she was specific legislation and you may have been lobbying at that point. Also, if you just have an idea of how to fix a problem and it's specific enough that the legislator that you're talking to can write a bill from it, can create something to fix whatever problem it is that you're talking to them about, it could be considered specific legislation as well. Just so you know, there are some things that are not considered to be legislation, even though they may look like legislation to you. Most common would be working on regulations if you're trying to figure out with an agency, you know, how they should implement a new law or something. That's not legislation. Litigation is obviously not legislation because it's something that takes place in the third branch of our government, in the courts. Executive orders. So Trump has, you know, issued a lot of executive orders, but so has many of our state governors as we go through this unprecedented COVID-19, right? So if you're asking your governor to do something or not do something, as it relates to an executive order. That's not specific legislation. And neither is enforcement of existing laws. So we're going to have some brief examples, and if you can share with us in the chat, based on your crash course on lobbying, if you think that telling your senator to support a nominee for Secretary of State is considered to be lobbying. So are you having a communication with the legislator about a specific piece of legislation and you're expressing a view about it?
What do you all think?
Okay, I see a no.
And yeah, so I think the question here is this considered supporting or opposing a candidate?
So remember, the nominee becomes a specific piece of legislation. So this is lobbying because you are talking to a legislator, your senator, right? And you are expressing a view about a specific piece of legislation because you're asking your senator to support a nominee, which for the nomination process is considered to be a specific piece of legislation. So it's lobbying. This one about asking the president to sign an executive order to stop student loan repayments and interest accumulations until we have a vaccine. Is this considered lobbying? I'm assuming that it is not the current president. Jeff made a comment about how this is a waste of time. We're talking about prepping for a post-November America. So, you know, if we're talking about a different president, it might not be a waste of time. I got some, no, it's not lobbying because it's an executive order. And that's absolutely correct. It's not considered to be lobbying. This last example, urging the Secretary of Human Health Services to tell Congress not to repeal the ACA and commenting on HHS regulations on mental health parity. So for time's sake, I will move on and share with you that the first part of this, telling Congress not to repeal the ACA, is lobbying. And the second part on HHH regulation is not lobbying. So there may be some things that you're engaged in that might be a combination of both, okay? This example came from Impact Justice, and it's talking about supporting LGBTQ and Black Lives Matter and Black Trans Lives Matter. This is also not considered to be lobbying, right? Impact Justice is an organization that works on these issues. There's also no comment or communication to a legislator, and there's no specific bill that's mentioned. The census as well. This is a piece about how the census is not working as it needs to in New York City, and especially in the jails. Commenting about that is not considered to be lobbying either. And then the one thing that we have with grassroots lobbying that's different from direct lobbying is that we're talking to the general public, right? It's time to use our outside voices. And we're also including a call to action, which would mean telling somebody to contact a legislator, providing their contact information, providing a way to communicate with the legislator, or identifying legislators that are undecided or opposed to your view on the legislation. So you'll commonly see that in this form, like this: tell Congress, pass the COVID-19 Compassion and Martha Wright Prison Phone Justice Act. And then it says, sign this petition, right? And by putting in your information, we'll send this to your representative. That's IRS grassroots lobbying. Another way that you'll see it is here where you have comments about the HEALS Act leaving out many immigrants from testing and treatment. And then there's a script that urges you to call your senator and tell them to support the HEROES Act. That's also grassroots lobbying. Very briefly, there are lobbying exceptions that groups take advantage of all the time. The most common ones are nonpartisan analysis and technical assistance. We can definitely cover this in more detail if it applies to you on our technical assistance hotline. I just want to remind people, if I wasn't already clear, the rules that apply to print and verbal communication also applies to online communication. So to wrap up, the key points are: keep calm, and don't forget that nonprofits can engage in transition advocacy. C3s must still be nonpartisan. Nonprofits can lobby. If you take anything else from this training, remember that nonprofits can lobby. C3s must stay within lobbying limits and report lobbying to the IRS. And we're here for help. So you'll have our contact information, and I think I've seen Sham drop it in the chat box again. And then for more information, we have resources to help you. And as a plug, we are launching a podcast. It's coming August 19th, and you can find it on this link at boulderadvocacy.org/podcasts. And we will talk about this. We have examples of, is this considered to be something that a C3 can do? Is this something that's safe to do? And I think that puts us at time. I'm happy to stay for questions. I don't know how long this Zoom room will be open, but Sham and I will be here. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will get out follow-up emails to all of you who shared emails with us. And we're also here at Netroots Nation. I'm around, so feel free to ping me or contact us on our TA hotline, and we're happy to continue having conversations or answering questions that you have.
Thank you all for joining. And the last
Yes.
question, yeah, so 501c3s are allowed to lobby. They're limited in how much they can do, but, and again, they have to just stay within the limits, report, and remain nonpartisan.
You got it. Anything else? Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.